everyone. It's so good to meet all you guys. I've heard a bunch about you. My name is Caleb Stevens. For those of you who don't know, I've been a friend of the Maddoxes for a while. I grew up in Niagara area at the Wellandport Church of Christ is where I grew up, and then I've been in Sudbury, Ontario, 4 hours north of here, studying mechanical engineering. I heard I have somebody else in the audience who's doing that too. Yeah, I'll meet you later, I guess. So I've been up in Sudbury with the church there, and that's I'll introduce myself a little bit more later. My wife Maisie is here. Make sure to say hi to her. It's so good all to see you guys and to hear you sing praises and to pray. Thank you for that prayer. The sermon I want to talk about this morning is about working to the Lord and what that means and what the scriptures have to say about that. If you think about it, have any of you ever wanted to do something, like wanted to be with family or have some fun or something like that, but then you had to go to work? I'm sure that's happened to everybody. Yeah. Working can be a labor, like that's another word for it. It's a labor, it's a pain sometimes, it's an annoyance, it gets in the way of having some fun. Some of those kind of thoughts I want to preach on too, how to get ourselves encouraged off of that thought. And then some advice on how to work properly as well, and what working is. Maybe a lot of people think about working, doing the Lord's work or working for the Lord. I hear a lot of people say that synonymously with preaching or something like that, but there's a lot more. Doing work for the Lord is very, very vast, and actually that's something every single Christian can do. And when I say work, I mean like your employment. I mean stacking boxes in a warehouse or filling coffee cups at Tim Hortons. You can do that in a way that glorifies God, even if it's something that seems like menial labor or something like that. I've been in jobs like that, and they can get a little bit depressing. I remember I was unloading a transport truck, and I'm like, this box is as expensive as my entire day's salary. And it's like, this box is also as expensive as my entire day's work. And this box is like $80 boxes and stuff. And so work can be a little bit like that. So to begin, I would like to find the remote. There's the remote. And then next, I would like to go to Genesis chapter 1.
Did you get that remote to work?
You know what? I never got it to work.
No, I never could get it.
Okay, so I'm going to have to reach. Genesis chapter 1, please. To begin with the beginning of work. So in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, it says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God made man in his image." So God made man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing, that moves on the earth." And God said, "See, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed, to you it shall be for food." And he goes on to give him authority over all the animals as well. So that's the beginning of work. Man was created. He has mankind, man was created in God's image, male and female, and he tells them both have dominion over everything. So that's like their position. They had some rules. God sets them up in the beginning. If you look at chapter 2, verse 15, God, like in between all these verses, he creates the Garden of Eden, and it's very beautiful. And then in verse 15 it says, "Then the Lord took man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it." You can think, I've heard it preached before that God gave this man He creates this man, he gives him everything he needs to be really content in life. He gives him a place to live, a woman to love, and a job to do, and something to do. And that's like a pretty good recipe for contentment for him. And if you think about it there, he tells him to tend and keep the garden. At this point, mankind hasn't sinned. They haven't sinned yet. God hasn't taken the tree of life away. He tells them they can eat that. And so God gives him a job before ever sin entered in the world. Work was a thing. However, it seems to be like it was more for fun. Or he had a job to tend and keep the garden, but it wasn't for his survival, is what I should say, rather than fun. I should say it wasn't for his survival. He was going to live. He was going to eat of the trees of the garden. And then that all changes in chapter 3. Look at chapter 3, verse 17. I'm assuming you guys all know the story of when they eat of the fruit, and then the snake comes and deceives them. And so in verse 17 of chapter 3, God is telling them the punishments of their sin. And he says, then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and you have eaten from the tree which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. And listen to this. He says, in the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you are taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. So now, by the sweat of his face, that's going to be some hard work. Because of sin, work is not going to just be something he does like for his hobby or his interest. He's not just going to be tending to the Garden of Eden. He's going to have to work for his survival. Mankind is going to have to work for their survival now. And that's the origin of needing to work, and why we do our 9 to millions every day. And why we go through this fundamentally is because we live in a sinful world without the tree of life, and if we didn't work, we would starve to death. That's the basis of the thing. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. Now God, like if you want to take it, I think with the audience that has an average age that's pretty young, this illustration will go off well, I hope. But if any of you know the game Minecraft, okay, sounds good. You could maybe think of this like God had it on creative mode before, where you were just like, I want to build some trees, I want to get rid of these vines, I can do this for fun and interest and plant some stuff over here. But afterward, God switched it to survival mode, and now you're gonna die if you don't eat. So if you think of it that way, it's not just for fun. Now Adam, he can't just build this cool castle anymore. He's got to go actually work for his food. And so if that's the way to think about it, that's maybe what happened here. So that's the origin of work. It's because of that sin in the Garden of Eden that we can't just have fun all day and have a nice party time in the jungle. So God talks, I forgot to put that up, sorry. Genesis 3:17 was the other verse. Proverbs talks a lot about work. The Bible goes on, time goes on, and people are working. That becomes the norm. Adam and Eve are really the only people that get to ever live in a time where they didn't have to work for their food. And in Proverbs, we talk about the problem. The Bible talks about the problems with not working. In chapter 6, Proverbs chapter 6, verse 6 says, go to the ant, you sluggard. Or you can imagine it, you slug. He's saying, you're a slug, look at an ant. Consider her ways and be wise, which, having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. How long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So your poverty shall come on you like a prowler, and your need like an armed man. So God talks about the warning of laziness. We have another one in chapter 26 to look at as well. Proverbs chapter 26. He's imagining a lazy man. Proverbs chapter 26 verse 13 says, the lazy man says, there's a lion in the road. a fierce lion in the streets. As a door turns on his hinges, so does the lazy man on his bed. He's going back and forth. Like a door opens, he rolls. Hey, get out of bed. We got work to do. No, rolls back over. Oh, the sun's in my eyes. Rolls back over. He's not getting up to get about his work day. He's rolling around in his bed. Verse 15, the lazy man buries his hand in the bowl, and it wearies him to bring it back to his mouth. That's always been a funny illustration to me. I just imagine this really big fat guy who's just like he's getting another Dorito chip and he's like, oh, I'm too lazy to get it back in my mouth. But the illustration, I think, is bigger than that. This person puts his hand in the bowl but can't feed himself. And a lazy man is going to have trouble feeding himself if he won't get out of bed and do that. And then it says in verse 16, the lazy man is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. So God made work in the beginning. Before I continue, I want to look at another verse in Ephesians chapter 4 to hit something about this in the New Testament. God has made work from the beginning as a punishment for that sin, and then He wants us to actually do it. Ephesians chapter 4 verse 28 says, let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give to him who is in need. So I hope you see between the Proverbs and Ephesians verses, being lazy or stealing to get your bread is not the way to get it. By the sweat of your face we shall eat bread all the days of our life has been our punishment. And that's a fact of life. And so the first major point, I have several major points. The first major point is don't neglect that fact. It's part of the facts of life. Now, work is a part of the facts of life. We might, like, God lets different people have different levels of wealth and comfort, and that's at His own discretion and stuff like that. But working hard is a fact of life that is actually going to turn out better for us in the end if we do it. The next major point is about working too much. People can work not enough and be like the lazy man who's too lazy to even bring his hand back into his mouth and feed himself. But people can also be overworking to the point that they neglect the spiritual realities of life. And Ecclesiastes is probably the best place in the Bible to talk about this sort of thing. So please turn there next. That's where we'll be for the next little while. I asked John if we could do the reading in the beginning to get us thinking through some of the things that Ecclesiastes said. If you're interested in this topic more, I'm only going to have time to read specific points out of it. But if how to work and what the purpose of this physical life is, and what's the point of it, things like that, those are pretty big philosophical questions. If you have those questions, Ecclesiastes is a great book to read on your own, a little more than we'll be able to talk about in this lesson. Solomon's very wise. All right, I'll turn to it now myself. We'll get reading. I'll pick up in chapter 2 after John left off this morning. Chapter 2, verse 1 of Ecclesiastes. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity. I said of laughter, madness. And of mirth, what does it accomplish? So this man is a king. He's so rich. He's very, very, very rich and very powerful. And he says, I'm going to test you with mirth, which is like rejoicing and happiness. And he says, I'm going to enjoy pleasure. This is a very common aspiration. I want to have the good life. I want to have the success. People call it success today. I want to have all the money in the world, to have all the shoes and clothes and cars and apartments and penthouses and all the riches of this world. I'm going to have power and money and fame, and even like that's what really rich people aspire to. But even a lot of people think if they work so hard, they can just have all their cares in the world taken away. and just have pleasure all the time and never have to worry about anything. That's probably one of the most sought after goals of people, to work. They want to work to where they don't have to worry about anything and they can just have fun and have enjoyment and pleasure all the time. And this guy is actually rich enough to do it, so he says, I'm going to do it. I'm just going to have all the fun I want. But then he says it's madness, and he says, what's the point of it? In verse 2. Verse 3, he says, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men, to do under heaven all the days of their lives. I made my works great, I built myself houses, and planted myself vineyards, I made myself gardens and orchards, and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants, and I had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who are in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on all the labor which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. And I want to talk about that for a second. So imagine you get the best job you think you possibly can, the best degree if you're going to school, the best, you get in a workplace and you get promoted as high as you can. You get all the nice plaques on the wall. You buy the house on the hill, and the big house and the nice cars. He talks about his music. You've got the best playlist of anybody around. You have everything you possibly need and want, and you look good to people. Solomon gets that, his version of that in his day, and he looks on it and he says, this is all vanity. Vanity means uselessness. It's all useless, and it's grasping for the wind. He's trying to satisfy his life with stuff, and then he looks at it and he's like, now this will make me happy. But then he's not satisfied with it. He always wants more. He says this is trying to grab the wind. You can imagine the wind's blowing by. Some of you know about the wind we just had lately. Imagine trying to grab it. You can't grab that. It's going to blow the trees down. And that's what he says, trying to make yourself happy just with stuff is. And this is a guy who's done it all. And that's what we see here. Down in verse 22, we read, for what has man for all his labor, and for the striving of his heart, which he has toiled under the sun? For his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This is also vanity. This is also vanity. And he says something very important here. After he does all this, he says, nothing is better for a man that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy the good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Now let's break apart what that means. He says nothing is better for a man that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. Solomon talks about how it's much more learning to appreciate the perspective you're in rather than being in a specific place. It's not getting to the house on the hill, it's enjoying the house that you have now and learning to see the good things about the place of your own job. How many people can you make happy in the morning who are really sad without a coffee, and then you give them a coffee and you make their day? Sometimes there's bad things about a job like that, but sometimes there's Solomon wants us to think more about enjoying the good sides of all of our jobs and our labors, and to be thinking like that. And then he says, he gives knowledge and wisdom and joy to a man who is good in his sight, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting. And I think maybe what he's getting at here is to a person who doesn't have any view of God, to a person who doesn't have a view of the afterlife or a purpose beyond their physical achievements, it maybe just feels like toiling, gathering, and collecting. Today I'll get a little bit more, today I'll get a little bit more, today I'll get a little bit more. But a person who has a godly focus can have joy because they have different milestones and goals in their life, spiritual ones that last longer. And maybe that's what Solomon's getting at here. Another place I want us to turn to is in chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes. This is talking about looking at other people's work and envying it. Chapter 4, verse 4 says, "Again I saw that for all the toil and every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind." That's a fact a lot of people fail to realize. The Bible advises us by the wisest man in the world that God gave him wisdom. From God, he says, better is one handful with quietness than two hands full with toil and grasping for the wind. And that's a very important fact for us to remember. We continue on in verse 7, he says, "Then I returned and saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone, without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion, but woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up again. If two lie down together, they will keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken." He talks about all that in the same context of what is the point of what you're working for. He talks about this first with envy. Are you working just to impress somebody else? Are you working just to be like somebody else? He says that's vanity. That's useless. Working just to be somebody else or to be like them, to envy what they have and try to fit yourself into their life is one of the useless things that Solomon has learned about. And then he says there's this guy who works all the time. He deprives himself from good. And I see people like this in the world today who are working many hours for nothing but themselves to climb the ladder, but they're not married, they don't have kids, they barely ever see their family. They have no one to work for, but at the end of the day, they're sitting in a really nice, expensive house. And Solomon says that's a vain thing. He never asks, why am I doing this, and why am I depriving myself of a good life with people? Solomon tries to focus us to think more about the people and the relationships in our life than the money. There are people who have to work all day long and many, many, many hours to help their family and even to keep themselves alive sometimes. But that's different. Working for a family is much different than working for yourself and for no one and depriving yourself of all this. Solomon tries to get us to think that the point of life is not necessarily money, and you're going to be a lot happier if you have friends to share the stuff you do accomplish, even if it's less. That's what we get from Ecclesiastes chapter 4. And finally, across the page in chapter 5, I'm going to look at one more point about this in our work life. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 8 to 17. "If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter." Now, the Bible wants us to do something about oppression and violence and stuff. He tells us to give, to help the poor. So he says he doesn't want us to just ignore when we see these sorts of things. But he does say, if you see that happening in the world, don't be surprised. You want to help it, but don't be surprised, he says. Don't marvel if you see poor people and other people being oppressed. He says, for high official watches over higher official, and higher officials are over them. Verse 9, he says, moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. Another very important thing. If you love money, you're not going to be satisfied with money. Trust this guy. He's been there. He's done it. He has all the money, all the silver, all the gold in the world. And he wasn't happy with it. And that's what he's trying to teach us through God's wisdom. This is useless. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver. He who loves abundance with increase, this also is vanity. Verse 11, when goods increase, they increase those who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes? He says, listen to this part. The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much. But the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. There is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun. Riches kept from their owner to his hurt, but those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there's nothing left in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return, to go as he came, and he shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a severe evil. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go. And what profit has he who has labored for the wind? All his days he also eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. That's the picture Solomon produces for us of a guy who thinks that he's going to be satisfied with money, but then compromises his family and estranges himself from the world because of that sort of thing. And he says it might perish away in misfortune anyway, and then for all that work you have nothing to give to your kid. Sometimes natural disasters or things that are not even up to you can happen. And so he says, how much more should you not try to be satisfied with money, because things that are not even your fault could come, take away all your wealth, take away your money, and then you're left with nothing, and you're unhappy, and you have nothing to give to your kids anyway. So that's a very poignant remark for us to remember. He says this is all vanity. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver. It's a very important thing for a Christian to learn. As I've been saying, so that's the second main point. First main point was not working at all will lead to your God does not want you to steal for your food or to be lazy for your food. God does not want that. He's the one that took the tree of life away and made the world a world where by the sweat of our face we're going to have to eat our bread. So don't be lazy, but also don't put too much value on working hard and value. There's a lot of cultures and a lot of people that have that mindset that work is your value, and how much you're doing it. But Ecclesiastes wants us to focus on other things in life for our value. So that's that point. And then finally, the New Testament talks a lot about how we can be good employers and employees in that sort of relationship. And I want to finish with a few places in the New Testament. Like Colossians chapter 3, verse 22. Now, once we understand that we need to work, you say, okay, I got it. I can't be lazy, and I need to find my value and worth in something besides money. Got it. But now, going to work, there's a lot of advice that the scriptures give for us on how to do this in a godly way. This is where throwing boxes off a transport truck can be the Lord's work or something like that, or any sort of thing, banking and financing or engineering or any little thing, being a doctor, anything like that can be working to the Lord. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, chapter 3, verse 22. Bondservants. Oh, and I should quickly mention, I'm relating the olden days, they called their employers, they had slaves back then. Some of them were for very evil reasons that God would hate. It seems like their definition of slavery was different than ours from our recent past. They could have hired servants, hired slaves. Jesus tells a few parables where that's the word. So I'm kind of relating that to the employee kind of relationship for us as well. So what Paul tells them, they still had to work, and they were working for people that paid them. So all these things about masters and servants applied to, you can think of it like employer and employee. So Colossians 3 verse 22, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. But he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you have a master in heaven. So think about this. Do you know anyone today who only works hard when the boss is looking? That's a severe problem in the world today. There are people who don't care about the work that they're supposed to do unless they can get credit from the boss from it. And he says, don't do this with eye service. That's what it means. Don't work hard just when people are going to see you. That's the kind of attitude that God wants for a Christian, a guy who does it who does the right thing or does what his boss tells him to do, the way his boss tells him to do, even when the boss isn't looking. And then if you think of that verse in chapter 4, verse 1, masters, give your servants what is fair. Have you ever known a master that does not want to give you any cent or help more than he possibly have to, and tries to rip you off of every single minute and second and penny he possibly can? Like there are employers like that, and God would have a lot of words for them as well. Be happy to give people stuff if you find yourself in the employee relationship, and then work hard. Not just when the boss is looking as an employer. The next one's in Ephesians chapter 6. And I'll put them all up on the board and we'll just go quickly through them. Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 5. Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ. Wow. He says, obey your masters as you would Christ. Now he does say according to the flesh. That's very important. If your boss wants you to do something sinful, then that's why he says according to the flesh. According to all things spiritual, you defer to God. You do that first. But he does say, obey your masters like you obey Christ. That's a big thing to say. And then again, in here he says, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord. Isn't that a good thing to know? Every time you could have done something, and maybe got away with it at work, took a little extra money, like just relax because the cameras aren't on today or something like that, took many more breaks than you should have or anything, but then every time you decided, no, I should do the thing with integrity, God says, whatever you wouldn't have got there, I'm going to give to you. He says, you're going to get the same from the Lord. In verse 9, and you masters do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. The next one's in First Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 says, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man. Now we think of this usually in talking about governments, but he says every ordinance of man. So even if your boss tells you to do something dumb that you think is not the best way to do this, he says do it. You might be thinking, I could do this so much easier. This is not the right way to do it. I'm just going to, when he leaves, I'll do it the better way in my mind. But he says, obey every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether the king is supreme or to governors or those who are sent by him. And he goes on, and then he gets to verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the harsh. Has anyone ever had a harsh boss? That's something you have sometimes in life, and God says you gotta be submissive even to the harsh bosses that we have. For this is commendable, he says, because if because of conscience toward God, one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. What credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. And he goes on to teach us about Christ's example. So that is the lessons in the New Testament that God has prepared that can really help us relate to the boss, the employer and employee relationship. Christians are not to be these like rebellious people who are not contributors to society, who leech off people and who are lazy and are the worst kinds of workers. A Christian should be the best employer as well, but also employee that a boss finds. That's the kind of thing, because that's such an example that you can give to other people. That in itself is preaching the gospel. When you put up patiently and when you obey your boss, he's going to see that. He's going to say, why do you actually listen to me and nobody else does? That is in a way doing the Lord's work without even speaking. So finally, I want to end with this back in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 18. We started off in this sermon talking about how work started because of that sin. Work started because God made it, but it started to be a pain. It started to be something that by the sweat of our face, we have to eat our bread. We have to suffer and work for it. Sometimes it's hard and it's annoying, and we would much rather do other things. Work is sometimes not very fun. Sometimes all the time not fun, depending on what kind of job you got. But work is not fun, and we think of it. I started off talking about how it's because of that sin. But when God punishes people, he never punishes them in ways just to hurt them. This wasn't just a punishment. All punishments from God are with the exception of your final death and being sent to hell, if hopefully that's never anybody, but with the exception of that, all of our punishments that happen in life are to help us. And so God made work something that's not just a pain and a labor, and by the sweat of our face we're going to eat bread and that's going to be miserable. He did this for us to help us have more fulfilling lives in a world that's corrupted by sin. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 18. Here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor, in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, and given him the power to eat of it, to receive his heritage, and rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart. So work is not just a punishment, it's a gift from God for us to enjoy and feel like we've accomplished things. Thank you so much for listening. That's the lesson this morning on working to the Lord. I'll let John take it from here.
Now let's take a few minutes break.